My next guest is a New York Times bestselling author and speaker with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Nabeel Qureshi was raised in a devout Muslim family. While in college, he began to examine the Islamic teachings while also investigating the history of Christianity, which eventually led him to convert to the Christian faith. Well, now Nabeel has written a very timely book that speaks into the current cultural climate of the day. With news of terrorist attacks, jihadism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram, conversation around Islam and the motivations behind some of this activity has many wanting to know more about the teachings of Islam and asking the question, is Islam truly a religion of peace like many claim it is? Welcome, Nabeel.
Thanks, Maggie. It's good to be here.
It's an honor to have you here. I loved reading this book. You state at the very beginning that you were kind of weary about delving into this topic. People had asked you to speak into this for a while, and you had said no.
Well, the issue of jihad is so charged right now that people will question what your motives are when you talk about it. Because on the one hand, if you talk about jihad as if it's a reality in Islam, then you can come under accusations of Islamophobia. Whereas if we don't talk about it at all, we're leaving our borders open or perhaps policies defenseless to what could be future attacks. So it's a very difficult issue to deal with, and I wanted to stay hands off.
So why did you decide to delve in?
Because after the attacks in Paris, all of a sudden the tension just rose. I was in England at the time. It reminded me very much of the 7/7 bombings. And then shortly after that...
The 7/7 bombings in England, right.
And then shortly after that, San Bernardino happened, and I was back in the States at that time for Thanksgiving. And then it felt even worse than it felt right after 9/11, where people were just angry and confused. They had just forgiven people after the Paris attacks, and they didn't know how to handle the situation. And so what I didn't hear in this very charged political climate in the United States was something that was both charitable and also truthful. I heard one or the other, but not both. And so I felt like a voice needed to speak up, and that's why I wrote the book.
And what I appreciate about this, Nabeel, is that you say at the very beginning, you want this to be objective. This is not an us versus them. This is not Christian versus Islam. But this is an objective look at Islam, basically.
As objective as I can be. I was trying not to import my Christian perspective so that it could be useful to people at large. The fact is, when you're looking at Islam's origins, you have texts. You can just read it, and you don't have to put too much of your lens on top of that.
So tell our viewers a little bit of the backstory. How did you become a Christian? You came, as I said, from a devout family. Your mother wears a burqa as well as your sister. So that's an example of how devout your family was. A long line of missionaries, and you become a Christian.
And this is exactly why I feel like this is such an important time for us to engage this issue, because for me, a large part of the search happened starting at September 11th.
See, it was kind of like a tectonic shift, like an earthquake, not in our world, but in the Islamic world as well.
It was, especially in my world, because growing up, I had been taught that Islam was a religion of peace. I didn't use that phrase as if it were a propaganda or a lie. That's what I was taught as a Muslim, and therefore I truly believed it. And that's why when I hear Muslims say today, Islam's a religion of peace, I don't accuse them of lying. But after September 11th happened, people wanted answers. How do you explain what these people did? Clearly they did it in the name of Allah. What about all the other incidents? If it were a one-off thing, maybe that could just be, them. But tons of people are doing this around the Muslim world. So how do you explain it? And it was through investigating their perspective. Those terrorists, they don't say, they don't do it silently. They tell you why they do it. And going back to the history of Islam, looking at the Quran, looking at Muhammad's life to say, what do these texts actually teach? And it was in the course of investigating my faith objectively as possible, that I encountered a violent reality of Islam.
Let's talk about that. I found this fascinating. You say in the book, Muslims are adherents of Islam, and Islam is the worldview of Muslims, but they are not the same. And you state that Muslims don't believe all the same things. Explain that.
Well, Islam is a religion. It's a system. It's a political, socio-religious, legal system. Muslims are people. And if we want to understand this, we can think about, for example, Christianity. You've got billions of Christians around the world, but they don't all believe the same thing. Even if the Bible says something, that doesn't mean all Christians believe it. Far from it. People have different interpretations. Some people might never have read the Bible. Some people might be Catholic and import a Catholic tradition. Some people might be Protestant and import a Protestant tradition. Same way with Islam. You've got Islam, which is the system, and Muslims of all kinds of stripes, denominations, cultural backgrounds, levels of devotion. And so Muslims are all different people, so we should treat them, especially from our perspective as Christians, we should treat Muslims as image bearers of God, broken though they might be. Whereas we can criticize Islam as a system, we should love the people.
The teachings of Islam. So tell me a little bit, in the book you talk about the idea that Islam is a religion of peace. And you go back to kind of study Muhammad. And the first 13 years of his life were very peaceful, but something changed.
So, according to the Islamic traditions, now there's a whole discussion about how reliable they are, but if we assume the Islamic traditions, Muhammad claims to be a prophet around 40 years old, which is 610 AD. And then for the first 13 years, he's preaching a message of monotheism. He's preaching a message of taking care of widows and orphans. He himself was an orphan growing up. His father died before he was born. His mother died shortly thereafter. So he saw the conditions of the underprivileged, and he argued that we should support them and take care of them. That's what his ministry was like for the first 13 years. But when he ultimately fled to Medina, that is when he was able to start fighting. That is when he had an army at his control. And it was that very year that he started launching raids. And from that point till his death, we see a crescendo, an escalation of violence in his life.
And when we talk about violence, you indicate, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, Surah 9 as being one of the most violent books or part of the Quran.
Exactly. So the Quran is not in chronological order. So chapter 1 is not the first. Chapter is actually in the 90s is the first one. The last chapter chronologically to have been composed is Surah 9. It is, bar none, the most violent. It's called Surah al-Bara, which means the chapter of disavowal. And it's basically disavowing all treaties with polytheists and also with Jews and Christians. And it tells Muslims to fight the unbelievers, to slay the infidels wherever you find them, take them captive and lay siege to them. That's chapter 9, verse 5. Chapter 9, verse 29 says specifically, Jews and Christians, fight them until they are subjugated and pay you money. Why? A few verses later, because Islam has been made to prevail over every other religion. Chapter 9, verse 33. Chapter 9, verse 111 is the one that says, if you die in jihad, you will go to heaven. So it launches Muslims right before Muhammad dies into this undelimited warfare. There was no end in sight. It was just fight. And that's why Muslims were able to conquer 1/3 of the known world. I'm talking from the shores of the Atlantic to the valleys of India within about 150 years.
So where does this idea that this is a religion of peace come from?
The words, the religion of peace, Islam is a religion of peace, is found nowhere in the Quran. It's found nowhere in the Hadith. It's not even really found in any polemical literature, any commentaries until the 20th century. So this is a modern phrase that was invented by people in India who were interacting with British folk. This was before India was reverted to its own control. And so that's where we see the phrase Islam is a religion of peace coming up in interactions between Western culture and Islam, usually when we're talking about polemics and apologetics.
So is it accurate?
Now, how do we mean the phrase Islam is a religion of peace? If we mean that there are peaceful Muslims, no one can argue with that. I would say the vast majority of Muslims in the world are peaceful, and I would say that without hesitation. But if we say Islam is a religion of peace, that's problematic because, again, Muslims are not Islam. Islam is the system. And like I said, Muhammad had been fighting from the first year that he could until he died. And he launched Muslims into battle such that they conquered 1/3 of the known world, and then they kept fighting. From that time until the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Muslims had a significant degree of military control throughout the world. It's really hard to say in any way that Islam is a religion of peace when we're talking about physical peace.
Now, when we talk about jihad, it's always kind of been told or described in the context of religious, maybe offense, not really, and so it's, or defense, I should say, and not really considered a violent thing, but more defending a faith. Is that correct?
In the West, that's what we were told growing up, that Muhammad only fought defensive battles. He was trying to protect the Ummah, the Muslim people. The fact is, though, when you get past the modern narratives and you start reading the text of the Quran directly, and you start reading the history of Muhammad's life directly, there's no question that's not the case. He launched raids. Even the first battle that the Muslims fought, the Battle of Badr, was a result of a raid that he launched against a caravan. that Muslims fought. And so from the beginning, there's no real distinction actually in that time between offensive and defensive battles. If you have an enemy, you fight them, is basically the way people saw it. And that wasn't just Muslim, that was everyone back then. But you cannot argue that Islam conquered 1/3 of the known world defensively. That doesn't make any sense.
In your book, you also talk about jihad is a defensive move, or could be seen as a defensive move, but it has to be kind of claimed by someone in power. So, for instance, Osama bin Laden would say, would direct Al-Qaeda to, have some sort of a jihad moment, and I apologize for the way I might be describing it, but it has to be kind of claimed by someone in the upper echelon, basically.
Yeah, so there were rules of jihad that were concretized a few hundred years after Muhammad. So Muhammad didn't lay out these rules per se. After the hadith, the traditions of Muhammad's life were collected, then people systematized, codified jihad. And in that codification process, there were conditions listed. A jihad should only be launched in defense of the Muslim people or for the purposes of advancing the Islamic faith. So it doesn't have to be just defensive. And it should be launched by a leader of the Muslim people. So this is why some people argue that after the Ottoman Empire fell, you couldn't have a legitimate jihad until ISIS came, because ISIS is establishing its own caliphate. And this is why it's such a big issue across the Islamic world, whether to recognize the caliphate of ISIS or not, because if so, then they could launch officially recognized jihad. So it's actually, these rules are important. I was actually speaking to a pastor in Nigeria the other day, and he said that in his neighborhood in Jos, Nigeria, before Muslims attack, and it happens quite regularly, they will distribute pamphlets saying, "Be forewarned, we will be attacking you."
Really?
Yep, and it's sometime within the next 2 weeks after those pamphlets come. And you ask the question, why would they do that? Because it is one of the rules of jihad. You have to tell people that they are going to be attacked.
Wow. Our time is running low or running out, but how do we as Christians kind of make ourselves knowledgeable about this in order, you say in the book that this is not just a Christian book, you want to be able to educate everybody. How do we use this, especially in a world where we are encouraging more Syrian refugees to come in? And I talked to you about a lot of fear that people have with are there terrorists coming in this group? And we hear of all of these terrorist attacks. How do we as Christians battle this and love our neighbors instead of fearing them?
I think that's a very critical distinction that we as Christians have to make. Are we primarily concerned with our own interests or with following Jesus? And if we are honest with ourselves and we say, I'm primarily concerned with following Jesus, then the answer is Jesus was willing to lay down his life for the sake of those who were his enemies. Romans 5:8, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And so we shouldn't be worried about trying to preserve our own lives. Now, does that mean we should just let dangerous people into the country? No, because there are innocents here that we want to protect as well. But we shouldn't be afraid for our own lives. We should be seeing our lives as tools to reach people. And this is the perfect opportunity to reach people for the gospel. I'm not saying that the refugee crisis is a good thing, but God is able to use all things for the good of those who love him. And so in this time, we can receive people, we can love them, we can share Christ with people who would never have otherwise heard of him. And I think that's how we as Christians should be seeing this.
Well said. Thank you again, Nabeel. The book is called Answering Jihad, A Better Way Forward. Watch this and you'll see how you can get your copy.